Hola amigas y amigos y bienvenidos a esta lección sobre las preposiciones en español. Vamos. That's right, my friends. In this lesson, we are going to be talking about prepositions in Spanish. Now, if you do not know what a preposition is, don't worry because that's kind of what the majority of this video is about. Discussing what prepositions are and kind of how to conceptualize what role they play in a language. So before we get to prepositions, let's start off by talking about the parts of language that we have already discussed up until this point. So far we have talked about sentences that have like a thing, a doer of an action that does an action or acts upon another thing. That thing receives the action, and that thing transfers the action to a final place for which that action was done to or for. So maybe all that sounds confusing and you don't recognize any of that. I'm hoping that maybe these terms might seem more familiar to you because we've been talking about them a lot. We talk about the doer of an action, a thing does an action, a subject does a verb. And it does that verb to a direct object. The direct object receives the action from the subject, and then it transfers that action to an indirect object. So let me put this into a plain English sentence. Let's, for example, say, I, subject, hit, verb, the ball, direct object, to Thomas, indirect object. Just look at the flow of energy that went from me to the ball, from the ball to Thomas. And we see that flow of energy. And this is how I have conceptualized about these basic statements about how energy flows from one thing to another and how that's expressed in language. It has shown a relationship between two objects. So let me read what I've got here. In the diagram that I've made up here, we are seeing how objects in the universe relate to each other in terms of energy flow or action. Starts there at the white triangle that I'm covering up mostly. The lightning bolt represents the energy that flows to the little purple funny thing there that receives that action and then transfers that action to our indirect object, the red square. Again, this is just a diagram to kind of represent how I think about the flow of energy in most of the sentences that we say in our lives. But there are other kinds of words besides subject, verb, direct object, indirect object, and these words express other kinds of relationships that exist in our universe. So let's look at the right side of the screen here, okay? There are many, many ways that objects can relate to each other, namely, and I say namely for the sake of this video, we want to look at the ones that are spatially and temporally related. We want to be able to express how they are related spatially and temporally. So what the heck does all of that gobbledygook mean? Well, let's look here at the example of the moon and the clouds. In your own words, I want you to take a moment, pause if you have to. What is the spatial relationship of the moon to the cloud? What could you say? If I asked you the question, where is the moon in relation to the cloud? How would you describe it? I would say that the moon is behind the cloud. I've just used that word behind to express a spatial relationship between moon and cloud. Now, what if I asked you to switch the perspective and say, where is the cloud in relation to the moon? Perhaps you're saying the cloud is in front of the moon. There we've just expressed a spatial relationship between the cloud and the moon. Now let's look at this other little diagram that I've got that's got the little arrows. We got yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So if I asked you to tell me, where is yesterday in relationship to today? Sincere question, what would you say? Perhaps you, like me, would say yesterday is before today. Where is tomorrow in relationship to today? Perhaps you're saying tomorrow is after today. Okay, what about this one? Where is today in relationship to yesterday and tomorrow? I'm thinking today is between yesterday and tomorrow. Well, all of these words that we have just discussed, behind, in front of, after, between, before, these are all examples of prepositions. Prepositions. And here's how I would define a preposition. Let me move my little guy over here and cover up this diagram since we're done with that for now. Prepositions are words that show spatial and temporal relationships between objects and events. If you're unclear, the word temporal means time. Relationships involved in time as opposed to space. So on the left side of the screen, we've got the moon is behind the cloud is in front of the moon. That shows a spatial relationship. On the right side, we've got a temporal relationship in that yesterday happened earlier in time. It happened before today in time. That's a temporal relationship. So that's what I meant by there. Probably I should have clarified temporal a bit sooner. But let's see if we can use this definition to identify some prepositions in these sentences right here. Number one, think about spatial relationships between two objects, two or more objects. The rat ran among the partygoers. Well, I'm seeing the two objects here as the rat and the partygoers. Now, think about the spatial orientation of this rat in relation to the partygoers. What word, number one, would you say is a preposition? I hope you're thinking among. The rat is among. Its spatial orientation. The partygoers are on either side or all sides of this rat, and he is just there in the center. He's among the partygoers. Number two, she gets her birds from Costa Rica. Well, think about the relationship between the birds and Costa Rica. The birds, they originated in Costa Rica, but they are no longer there. They have come from there, which tells us that the birds are outside of Costa Rica. They came from there, they're outside. So the preposition in this example is from. They live in Florida during the winter. Anybody, before I give any clues, have an idea about what would be a example of a preposition in number 3? If you're watching the recorded version of this, go ahead and pause it and find it. If you're not, if you're watching it here live with me in class, let's look at number 3. They live in Florida during the winter. Okay, so what is the relationship between they and Florida? What is the spatial relationship? Inside, right? They are within the boundaries of what we call Florida. Now, there's another example of a preposition here. Where are they in relation to the winter? Well, now they're living during the winter. This is they are between the times that are marked as winter. Within those boundaries, they live during the winter. So we have two prepositions here, in and during. In represents a spatial relationship, whereas during represents a temporal, remember, a time-related relationship. Okay, number 4. Take a moment, maybe pause this and have a look before I continue on. Over the river and through the woods to grandmother's house we go. I see quite a few spatial relationships here going on. So let's think about we in relation to the river. It says we, where are we in relation to the river? Or where do we go in relation to the river? We go over. There is a spatial relationship. And we go through the woods. We go, well, what's the relationship between we and the woods? We go through. So there are woods on either side of us, and we are there in the middle. And then, where do we end up? Where are we in relation to grandmother's house? Well, we end right there at grandmother's house. We go to her house. So hopefully you have found all 3 prepositions here are over, through, and to. So now that we have defined prepositions, well, I've done my best to try to define what the conception of a preposition is. let's have a look at the prepositions that we have covered together this year so far. A means to, de means of or from, en means in or on, con means with, por means, well, por means a lot of different things, and so does para. In our next lesson, we are going to talk more about the definitions of por and para. So I'm going to skip over that for now and go on to sobre means over, durante means during, antes de means before, fuera de means outside of, debajo de, beneath, encima de, on top of, dentro de, inside of, and después de, after, and alrededor de, around. So these are the prepositions we have covered so far, and all of these in some way or other, whether concretely or abstractly, they represent a spatial or temporal relationship between two or more objects. Let's have a look here in the next screen here to try to illustrate this a bit better. Here, I have just taken a few of these, and in a feeble attempt to try to diagram the spatial or temporal relationships as best as I can for just a few of these. Because when we go to por and para, as I mentioned before, I'm going to have a lesson about those next, I want to maybe use a diagram that I've created to try to explain what por and para mean, try to conceptualize how they're used, because it is quite different than anything we think of in English. So here's some diagrams that I've made to try to explain a few of the prepositions that we've learned. A, in Spanish, remember, means to. So take, for example, we start at the beginning of a maze and we go to the end. So to represents that little arrow, but it doesn't have to just be spatial like a maze, or like we start at home and we go to grandmother's house. It could be temporal as well. Like we start at 1 o'clock and we go to 1:30. That would be a temporal relationship using the word to. Now durante, I think of durante exclusively, well, it means during, right? I think of this exclusively as dealing with time. So this is going to show a temporal relationship. Something is happening in the middle of an action or in the middle of a space of time or an event. So take, for example, he was talking during the movie. So that little arrow that we've got there would represent the talking, and then the movie would represent those two trapezoids that I've got drawn on there. So he was talking during this space of time, during this event. So that's how I kind of conceptualize of during using a diagram. Alrededor de, I'm making a clear reference to the solar system here, the planets orbiting around the sun. All right, so you got the sun at the center, and we have the concept of around illustrated by the planet and its motion in relation to the sun. So hopefully these diagrams kind of make sense to you, because I really want to use them in my next video. And these ones are pretty simple. My next video is going to use like a bit more of an advanced diagram. So I hope these basic ones kind of make sense, what I'm trying to get across as in conceptualizing what a preposition actually does. So let's get away from the conceptual stuff and talk about how we use prepositions in Spanish. You'll be happy to know that we have been using a prepositional phrase for months now, ever since our last unit when we were talking about using gustar, and we introduced this concept of an a phrase. Well, an a phrase is an example of what we have been talking about. It's an example of a preposition. That a there means to, and that is a preposition. We'll circle back to the idea here in a minute. Let's take a moment and remember exactly what an a phrase, or how an a phrase is used in a sentence. So, I ask you to translate the sentence, I pass her the bat. Feel free to take a moment to pause this, or if you're live with me, I'm going to probably pause this and we'll talk about it together, because I'm just going to put the whole thing splat on the screen here in 3, 2, 1. Yo le paso el bate. So, yo paso, I pass, el bate, the bat, le is to her, but it could also be to him, or it could be to you formal. So I'm going to use my special phrase that we've been talking about, this a phrase here, to clarify that this le refers to a her. Here we have it. Take a look. A ella. Yo le paso el bate a ella. Now, what if it wasn't a her? What if I wanted to pass the bat to him? Well, yo le paso el bate a él. Or if I'm saying to you formal, yo le paso el bate a usted. Here we see an example of a pronoun. See that pronombre is highlighted in yellow on our title there? We see examples of pronouns inside of an a phrase. And this is not new to us. We have seen these pronouns. Here, they're going to pop up on the screen. Here we go. Inside of an a phrase, we can say a mí, a ti, a él, a ella, a usted, a nosotros, a vosotros, a ellos, a ellas, a ustedes. We can put all of these pronouns inside of an a phrase to either clarify, like we just did with her, the bat, or you can emphasize. Remember, you can use an a phrase to say, well, I like chocolate. Even if you don't, I like it. A mí me gusta. A ti no, pero a mí sí me gusta. So you can use an a phrase to emphasize as well. And when you do that, when you put these pronouns inside of an a phrase, these are the ones that you use. Me, notice there's an accent on that I. Then ti, notice there's not an accent on that I. Then the rest are from way back. They're the subject pronouns that we learned back in month 1 of school. Él, ella, usted, nosotros, nosotras, vosotros, vosotras, ellos, ellas, and ustedes. So if you need to take a moment to write these down, we're moving on in 3, 2, 1. Here we go. The big reveal is that a phrases and prepositional phrases, frases preposicionales, they are the same thing. An a phrase is an example of a prepositional phrase. And just like a moment ago we had the a phrase, and there must be something inside of an a phrase. You just can't have a floating out there, not having something inside of it. So too must prepositional phrases have something inside the prepositional phrase. You can't just say the word de and not say from who or of whom. It's not clear. You've got to have of something or someone. So you've got to have something besides just the preposition. And if that something, let me move my little guy. If that something happens to be a pronoun, we're going to use the same pronouns that we have learned with our a phrases right here on the screen. So let's see this in action. Here we go. Here we have examples, the title again, pronombres, these pronouns, me, you, him, her, we. These pronouns that are inside a prepositional phrase, we're going to use the same ones from the a phrase. Here's an example, around me. So around is alrededor de, and then around me would be alrededor de mí. Over them, over is the preposition. Them is the pronoun. So over was sobre, and then them, well, it could be ellos or ellas, depending on if they're male, female, or mixed. A group of male and female. After you, well, after was después de, and if you're being formal, you're going to say después de usted. If you're being informal, you'll say después de ti, after you. With her, the word with was con. Now we're saying her, so we're going to say con ella. So these pronouns complete your prepositional phrase. With this exception. Are you ready? Write this down. We have a very important exception here. If I want to say with me, you are not going to, going back to the chart, you're not just going to take the word con and then put a me after it. This is an exception. So too is an exception, con ti. No one says con ti. Here we go. Instead, you're going to say, wait for my little thing to bounce away, conmigo and contigo. Please write that down. Conmigo and contigo. Once you get that down, let's go ahead and have a quick recap of this lesson. Number one, the purpose of language, to a great extent, is to communicate relationships among various nodes, that is, ideas, objects, people, events, actions, etc. If the goal of a sentence is to communicate a spatial or temporal relationship between two of these nodes, as I've just called them, it's very likely going to need a preposition. Remember, prepositions show relationships either spatial or temporal. So, if a pronoun finds itself within a prepositional phrase, such as an a phrase, for example, we have to use the following pronouns. You've got these listed already, I hope. Mi, ti, él, ella, usted, nosotros, nosotras, vosotros, vosotras, ellos, ellas, ustedes. There is the one exception. That is con followed by me, which would turn into conmigo, meaning with me. And then con followed by ti turns into contigo, which means with you. And there you have it, folks, an introduction to prepositions in general, but specifically prepositions en español. Gracias por su atención durante esta lección. Hasta la próxima. Chao.